6 meters beneath a medieval fortress, a researcher's brush uncovered something that made an entire team stop breathing. A jaw. Heavy. Ancient. Unmistakably human. And yet, unmistakably not us. For weeks, no one wanted to say out loud what the layers of soil around it seemed to suggest. Because if the dating was right, this jawbone was old. Not thousands of years old, not tens of thousands. Nearly 2 million years old. And it was sitting in the mountains of Georgia, thousands of kilometers from the one continent every scientist agreed early humans had never left. The textbooks were clear on this point. Our ancestors evolved in Africa, and they stayed there, confined by biology, by climate, by their own limitations, until a smarter, bigger-brained, more capable species finally emerged and walked out into the wider world. That was the story. That was the timeline. That was the safe, orderly version of human origins that had stood for decades. This jawbone did not care about the story, and what it was about to reveal, buried beneath a church, a fortress, and 1,000 years of forgotten history, would force scientists to tear up the map of human migration and start again. This is Dmanisi, and this is the discovery that proved humanity left home far earlier, far less prepared, and far stranger than anyone believed possible. To understand how impossible this discovery seemed, you first need to understand what nobody was looking for. Dmanisi was never supposed to be a story about human origins. For decades, it was known only as a medieval ruin, a fortress town along old trade routes through the Caucasus, with a church, defensive walls, and the quiet residue of Georgian kingdoms rising and falling. Archaeologists had been carefully excavating it since the 1930s, piecing together stories of merchants, soldiers, and stonemasons. Then, in 1983, something strange turned up in the wrong layer of soil. Bones. Not medieval bones. Not even remotely medieval. The remains of extinct animals, ancient rhinoceroses, saber-toothed cats, giant ostriches, creatures that had vanished from the earth long before the first stone of that fortress was ever laid. Somehow, an Ice Age world was sitting directly beneath the Bronze Age one, sealed and undisturbed for nearly 2 million years. It was strange enough to make researchers dig further. And digging further meant finding a stone tool. Simple, chipped from volcanic rock. Then another, a whole scattered toolkit belonging to a technology called Oldowan, among the oldest stone tool traditions ever identified, first discovered thousands of kilometers away in East Africa. Someone had made these tools. Someone had been here, in this valley, at a time when this entire idea should have been impossible. But tools don't have faces. Tools couldn't answer the question that was now impossible to ignore. Who were they? The answer was still 8 years away. In 1991, the jaw surfaced. And then, as if the ground itself had decided to finally give up its secret all at once, the discoveries kept coming. A skull in 1999, another in 2001. Then, in 2005, something that would ignite one of the fiercest debates in modern paleoanthropology. A skull so complete, so strange, that it would eventually force scientists to publicly question everything they thought they understood about our earliest ancestors. By the time the excavation was finished, 5 skulls had emerged from this single hillside. 5. An assemblage unlike anything else from this period of human history found anywhere on the planet. And every single one of them broke the rules. These were not the tall, confident, large-brained pioneers scientists had imagined striding boldly out of Africa. These individuals stood barely 1.5 meters tall.
Their brains were startlingly small, some no larger than 600 cubic centimeters, barely bigger than an ape's, less than half the size of a modern human brain. And yet here they were, in the mountains, nearly 1.8 million years old, further from Africa and further back in time than anyone had thought biologically possible. The safe, orderly story of human migration was starting to collapse. So picture for a moment exactly what these small-brained travelers were walking into. This was not the warm, forgiving savanna their ancestors had evolved for. The Caucasus of 1.8 million years ago was a colder, harder world. Open grassland mixed with patches of forest, fed by rivers running down from volcanic highlands, swept by seasons their bodies had never been designed to survive. Somehow, a population of early Homo had already pushed itself into a climate more punishing and unpredictable than anything their biology had prepared them for. And they were not alone out there. They shared this landscape with saber-toothed cats, with giant Etruscan wolves, with ancient bears and packs of predators built to kill things far larger and stronger than a hominin barely taller than a modern 10-year-old. There was no fire here yet, no sophisticated weapons, no advanced hunting strategy passed down through generations of accumulated knowledge. Just small bodies, small brains, and an unrelenting will to keep moving forward. How did they even get here? The leading theory is almost unsettling in its simplicity. There was no plan, no decision to leave Africa and conquer new lands. It was slower than that, and stranger than that. A population drifting outward across generations, following herds, following rivers, following the next patch of grassland over the horizon, never realizing they were rewriting the rules of their own species with every step. They didn't know they were making history. They were just trying to survive the next season. But surviving wasn't the only mystery waiting in that Georgian soil. The real controversy was still buried, because among those 5 skulls was one that would split the scientific community in two. It's known simply as Skull 5. Unearthed in 2005, formally revealed to the world in 2013, it remains one of the most argued-over fossils in the history of human evolution. Its brain case is the smallest of any adult Homo erectus skull ever discovered, roughly 546 cubic centimeters. Its face is large, jutting, almost primitive in its proportions. Its jaw is heavy-boned. And, strangest of all, it is almost entirely toothless, worn smooth, healed over, evidence of an individual who somehow survived for years after losing nearly every tooth in their head. When researchers set Skull 5 beside the other skulls recovered from that same hillside, the differences were staggering. So staggering that if these skulls had been unearthed at separate sites on separate continents, many scientists would have confidently labeled them entirely different species. One research team, led by Georgian scientist David Lordkipanidze, made a bold and controversial claim. These were not 5 different individuals from different species. They were a single, unusually varied population of one species, proof that early Homo was far more physically diverse than anyone had assumed. If that was true, the implications reached far beyond this one hillside in Georgia. It meant that several separately named fossil species discovered across Africa over the decades, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Homo erectus, might never have been distinct species at all. They might simply be natural variation within a single, adaptable lineage. The neat, branching family tree in every textbook
with its careful boxes and separate names, might be an oversimplified fiction. Not everyone agreed.
Many researchers pushed back hard, arguing it was reckless to erase distinctions between fossils separated by thousands of kilometers and hundreds of thousands of years based on 5 skulls from one Georgian hillside. The debate is still raging today. Dmanisi did not hand science a clean answer. It handed science a much harder question. And that question remains unresolved in journals and conferences right now, decades later. But the most haunting discovery at Dmanisi wasn't about species at all. It was about something far more personal. It came from that same toothless skull. Because losing your teeth in this world should have meant a death sentence. No fire, no cooking, no soft food. A diet that depended entirely on tearing raw meat and chewing tough, fibrous plants. And yet the bone around this individual's empty sockets had healed and remodeled over time, meaning they didn't die shortly after losing their teeth. They lived on, for years, possibly. Which raises a question researchers still can't fully answer. How does a toothless hominin, in a world with no fire, no tools for softening food, and predators at every turn, survive for years? One possibility is almost too tender for a species this ancient, this primitive, this small-brained. Someone else may have helped them, shared food, tolerated their reduced ability to contribute, kept them alive. Scientists are careful here. This is not proof, only a fragile possibility resting on a few worn, silent bones. But if true, it means that somewhere in this cold, predator-filled valley, nearly 2 million years before written history, before language as we know it, before anything resembling civilization, something that looks remarkably like compassion may have already existed. Not in us, in them. The ones with brains barely larger than an ape's. And that single detail changes how we should think about everything else these hominins left behind. Because what they left behind was almost nothing. The stone tools scattered around the site are shockingly basic. Simple flakes struck from volcanic cobbles, sharp enough to cut meat, nothing more. No hand axes, no refined technology. No evidence of controlled fire anywhere at the site. No shelters, no advanced weapons. Which means this population survived a cold, seasonal, predator-choked landscape with what is essentially the simplest toolkit in the entire human fossil record. Animal bones recovered nearby carry the proof of a brutal, uncertain existence. Cut marks from hominin tools sitting right alongside carnivore bite marks on the very same bones. These early humans were not always the hunters. Often they were scavengers, arriving just in time to steal scraps of meat before the next predator claimed the kill, competing directly with saber-toothed cats and giant hyena-like carnivores for the right to eat. This was not a population dominating its environment through cleverness. This was a population barely holding on, through adaptability, through movement, and maybe, just maybe, through the kind of social bonds hinted at by that one toothless skull. And somehow, against odds that should have erased them completely, they held on long enough to leave 5 skulls behind for scientists to find nearly 2 million years later. As dating technology advanced through the 1990s and 2000s, researchers repeatedly tested the volcanic layers surrounding the fossils, using methods precise enough to measure Earth's shifting magnetic field. Every test returned close to the same staggering number: 1.8 million years.
To understand how far that number pushed the boundaries of accepted science, compare it to what came before. The famous Java man fossils in Indonesia, once considered among the earliest evidence that humans had reached Asia, date to roughly 1 to 1.5 million years ago. Fossils from sites in China are younger still.
Before Dmanisi, the accepted timeline placed humanity's first steps outside Africa at around 1 million years ago, tied to a taller, larger-brained species carrying more advanced tools. Dmanisi didn't just push that timeline back by a few thousand years. It shattered it by hundreds of thousands of years and handed the discovery to a population that should never have survived the journey in the first place. Which meant one uncomfortable question now had to be asked out loud. If it wasn't a big brain that got early humans out of Africa, what was it? The evidence at Dmanisi points to something far simpler and far more universal than intelligence or technology. Not genius, not innovation. Something older than both. The same instinct that drives nearly every species on Earth. Follow the food. Follow the water. Follow the horizon, one generation at a time, without ever knowing where the journey ends. There is one more detail about this site that rarely makes it into the headlines, and it has nothing to do with the ancient hominins at all. Remember where this discovery was made. Not in some remote wilderness, but directly beneath a living, breathing medieval town. For centuries, people walked the streets of Dmanisi. They prayed inside its church. They defended its fortress walls. They dug grain pits into the very soil that concealed humanity's most distant relatives, sealed in volcanic ash nearly 2 million years earlier. None of them ever knew. Generation after generation, building lives directly on top of a secret none of them could have imagined lay beneath their feet. It's a strange, quiet reminder that history isn't a single line stretching backward from where we stand today. It's layered, folded, sometimes hidden just a few meters beneath the ground we already thought we understood completely. The debate over what exactly Dmanisi represents is still unfolding right now, in real time, among researchers who have spent entire careers studying these 5 skulls. Some argue this population was a distinct transitional group, not quite the classic African Homo erectus, not quite anything seen before, potentially even ancestral to the erectus populations that would later spread across Asia. Others hold firmly to the original, more conservative reading, that Dmanisi represents an early, isolated outpost of one highly variable species that began its journey in Africa. But almost everyone agrees on this. Dmanisi proved that the human story is not the tidy, linear diagram found in old textbooks. Early humans did not wait for bigger brains. They did not wait for better tools. They went early. They went small. They went with nothing more than sharpened stones and whatever fragile bonds held their small groups together. And somehow, against every expectation, in a cold and hostile landscape thousands of kilometers from where their lineage began, they survived long enough to leave a mark that would outlast empires, outlast languages, outlast nearly every civilization that would ever rise after them. Today, that Georgian hillside looks almost peaceful. The fortress walls still stand, worn smooth by centuries of wind. Tourists walk the same paths where Bronze Age farmers once dug their grain pits, unaware, just as those farmers were, of what still lies beneath. A small museum now sits near the site, holding the fragile, ancient skulls that quietly rewrote the story of our species. The individuals who once lived on that hillside
left behind no language, no art, no burial rites we can clearly identify. Only bone, only a handful of simple tools,
only a jaw worn smooth by decades of struggle, and a set of empty tooth sockets that may be humanity's oldest surviving evidence of one creature caring enough to keep another alive. And in that silence, they told modern science something it had gotten wrong. The human story does not move in a straight, confident line, from primitive to advanced, from Africa outward, from small brains steadily growing into large ones. It moves in strange detours, in unexpected leaps, in small, vulnerable populations pushing into hostile, unfamiliar worlds long before they seemed remotely ready. We are left with more questions than this discovery first appeared to answer. Were the Dmanisi hominins one wildly diverse population, or several distinct groups who happened to share the same hillside? Were they an evolutionary dead end, lost to time, or a direct ancestral link to the populations that would later spread across Asia? Did they truly care for their weakest members, or is that a story we simply want to see written into their bones? What is certain is this. On a quiet hillside in Georgia, buried beneath the ruins of a medieval town that has itself faded into memory, science uncovered proof that our earliest ancestors were bolder, more resilient, and stranger than anyone ever dared imagine. Long before fire, long before complex tools, long before anything resembling the civilizations that would rise in their place, a small band of early humans walked out of Africa and into the unknown, carrying nothing but their bodies, their will to survive, and whatever fragile threads of loyalty held them together in a world offering no guarantees at all. Their names are gone. Their language is gone. Even their species is still argued over by the very scientists who've devoted their lives to understanding them. But their bones remained, pressed into Georgian soil for nearly 2 million years, patient, silent, waiting. Waiting until 1991, when a single brush finally uncovered a jaw no one expected to find. And in that moment, without a word, without a name, they quietly rewrote the story of when and how humanity first dared to step beyond the only home it had ever known.